when I mentioned the various pieces that are particularly addressing a socialist feminist dimension, I forgot to mention the piece in the volume that does a survey of socialist feminist strategy today, and that's the piece by Joanna Brenner and Nancy Holmstrom. Sam Gindin is next, speaking to his essay in the volume on renewing unionism, registering socialism.
Thanks, Leo. My starting point is that we won't find hope through just some kind of false optimism. That our starting point has to be absolutely sober when we're looking at labor, about how deep the crisis in labor really is. The labor movement that came out of the 60s and 70s was attacked because of its economic strength, because it was actually affecting profits and productivity and inflation. Now the labor movement's being attacked because it's weak, and it seems like a wasted opportunity if you don't go after it. We once wondered if unions could become schools of socialism. Now the question is, can they even hang on to what they have? When neoliberalism came, we thought that, well, maybe there'll be a reversal here given the crisis, the deep crisis of capitalism, the delegitimation of finance, and even of capitalism itself. In fact, what we've seen is a consolidation. And we see that especially in terms of consolidating the defeat of the labor movement as a whole by going after the public sector. And the problem here isn't just a matter of leadership, of union bureaucrats. We have to really appreciate how deep the problem goes. There have been all kinds of impressive pockets of resistance, potentials that have been shown, Chicago teachers, the Walmart workers, there's all kinds of examples. Yet the fact about all of them is how limited they are, how sporadic this has been, how isolated those struggles have been, how they haven't been cumulative and added up to something new. The great defeat has been a lowering of expectations generally, and in the absence of collective organizations that people could struggle through, that people have turned to individual forms of survival with very severe impacts on the nature of the working class. What is so striking about what's going on is that in spite of everything that's happening to working people, and in spite of the vacuum of leadership in terms of what their unions are doing, there have been so few rebellions from below. One of the arguments that I emphasize in the book is that the problem in unionism gets to the very core of what unions are. The problem of unions is that they are fundamentally not class organizations, even though they come out of the class, but sectional organizations. Organizations that look at a specific group of workers and a specific set of problems, a narrow set of problems that they address. And that affects everything that they end up doing in terms of organizing their strategies, their relationship to their members, their relationship to the communities. That model of unionism had a moment in time when it actually made gains for workers, and those gains spread to others. But if there's anything we can learn from the last quarter of a century, it's that that period was unique, and that period is over. The last time we had a crisis that was anything as deep as the present one, something new happened in the labor movement at the same time. The labor movement was also at an impasse, and it came up with a new form of working class organization. It saw craft unionism, representing skilled workers, as having been exhausted, as having come to its limit, and the need for a new form of organization with new tactics and strategies. And the lesson for today is that getting over this impasse, getting over this profound crisis, means thinking bigger, and thinking bigger. Even if you want to win small, you're going to have to think bigger, but thinking bigger also means rethinking the very form of union organization and structures that we have today. Now, the dilemma in that is that it is very hard to believe that this can come from any dynamic internal to unions. It's very hard to believe that this can come from a leadership that either doesn't have the capacities, that's lost the capacities, or has vested interests in not radically transforming unions. But it's also very difficult to imagine this happening through working class rebellions from below, given the fragmentation of the rank and file workers, the lack of resources, their being cut off from their own history, the lowering of expectations that I mentioned earlier, and then simply a lack of confidence. In the past, we addressed this by saying, well, you need a party. That's the only place that this can come from. But what we also have to confront is that the left has suffered as great a defeat as unions themselves. The question of a party isn't on the agenda. So the question is, well, what can we do? What I throw up in the article is the question of forming an intermediate organization. Something that stands between the mass organizations with particular interest unions and social movements and a political party that isn't on, but looks at the question of transforming the state and transforming society. The role of that kind of an intermediate organization would try to establish workplace committees and networks of activists across those workplaces and the community. So there are three functions that an intermediate organization would perform. First, it would try to bring a class sensibility into unions. That doesn't mean that unions would be made suddenly into revolutionary or class organizations, but it would mean that bringing a class sensibility into them could make them more effective in terms of even defending their members, raising their expectations. Second of all, this kind of an intermediate organization would be a space where you can actually start engaging in the class struggle because of the links across unions, not just focused on each union, and the links in terms of all the other dimensions of workers' lives in the community. Third of all, the role of such an organization at this point in time would be to revive the question of socialism, to register socialism on the agenda again, to make socialists and to develop a socialist culture. Now, one of the questions is this just a temporary thing until there is a party? And it may be. I don't know the answer to that. I think that if you assume that we could one day have a perfect socialist party, the logic would be that you wouldn't need this kind of an intermediate organization. If you're suspicious about that possibility, then the role of an intermediate organization would be permanent. Magri has raised something like this in his work, because it would also be a check on the party. What I can't get into right now, but what I think is an important part of the article is struggling with, well, even if you had these structures, and even if this is what you're trying to do, what would it really mean? What would the interventions in the working class actually be? What would you put forth in terms of the policies or the structures or how public sector workers do things or how private sector workers do things, so that you would actually structurally start bringing class into this and building a different kind of a movement? And the other thing I try to deal with in the article is the experiment that we've done in Toronto around the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, and especially take a look at the limits of what's happened in the attempt to form that kind of an organization. And the point of looking at those limits is not to write it off. It's to actually recognize that we have to name and identify all the barriers that confront us in terms of going beyond where we are today, so we can start thinking about how do we overcome those barriers, what are the lessons. Thank you.
Picking up from there directly in terms of the question of party strategy, the volume looks at what's left of Leninism. There's an essay on the left party in Germany, Die Linke, by one of its full-time organizers. There's three essays, an interview that I did with the head of the planning committee of Syriza, and two essays on Syriza, one by one of its founding members, Michael Spurtalakis, who's on the Registered Collective, and as I mentioned, Hillary Wainwright. But these are all new and limited projects. And one of the things we tried to do in the volume is to draw lessons from the experience of those parties, those struggles, those political struggles with revolutionary possibilities that seem to promise most. Steve Hellman's look at the Italian Communist Party in that sense is very important in terms of figuring out what happened to the greatest mass working class party in a capitalist democracy. And John Saul's examination of the ANC and Kasatu and the SACP does that as well, in terms of all of the promise that the struggle against apartheid seemed to offer for a socialist project. So first Steve Hellman and then Johnson.
With something like that to live up to, I'm not sure where this is going to go. If you're expecting a resounding conclusion of what's the lesson and where do we go from here, you can probably leave now, because it's a as Eric Hobsbawm said in his review of the book when it first came out in Italian, even before it was translated into English, he called it shrewd and despondent, because it really did represent the experience of Lucio Magri as an activist in the Italian Communist Party, as someone who, a very curious and interesting figure in the Italian Communist Party, who came to it relatively late for someone of his generation, and lived through as a protagonist some of the most interesting moments both in the Italian Communist Party and also then on the Italian left after he was expelled from the party along with his comrades in the group known as Il Manifesto, and then the ups and downs of the far left, which he moved into and out of as a leader as much as a thinker, activist, and theorist. So it's a fascinating thing, and in fact my task in this essay is a bit different than that of others, and that really is to talk a bit and to reflect a bit about the book itself and to contextualize the book for people who might not have as much background in the history of the Italian workers' movement, the Italian Communist Party, and the Italian left, mainly to stimulate you to read the book, because it really is something that's very, very much worth reading, and that I can't conceivably do any justice to in, 6 or 7 minutes. So I'll just make a couple of very brief points, trying to pick up on a few of the themes that we're all concerned with here tonight. One, first of all, is that Magri himself, as I've already alluded, really is a very, very interesting character, because he's representative of a certain orientation and sentiment on the Italian left that runs transversely through the Italian left of the entire post-World War II period. And that is to say, if you've ever read Andre Gortz's Strategy for Labor, something that dates me, I think it was first published in 1967, but Gortz in that book talks about a strategy of radical reform for bringing about a socialist transformation within a capitalist framework that doesn't rely on the old seize the Winter Palace and smash everything to pieces, because it just ain't gonna happen, he said, and I think he obviously was correct in that. But this general trend on the Italian left in particular is extremely strong, and as I say, it's transverse. It runs historically across the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, independent leftists, various far-left groups, and even Catholics who never affiliated with a party. And it is really based on the notion of understanding that in modern capitalism you sort of have to attack simultaneously both the institutional bulwarks of the system and at the same time keep up constant pressure mobilizing from below, and Sam was alluding to this in some of his remarks as well, either through your own institutions or creating new institutions that keep pressure both on the system but also keep pressure on your own political leadership as a way of keeping them honest. And it was a very, very strong movement, and it happened to have a moment in the sun, more or less, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, because conditions in the Italian political scene, labor scene, capitalist scene, and every other scene just happened to reach the kind of peak that they reached, which was going on elsewhere in the world as well, to be sure, but perhaps reached a real peak of mobilization and potential transformation in Italy. And Magri was right in the middle of all that, and one of the most fascinating parts of the book is that it runs throughout his recounting the different experiences that he had and the ins and outs and ups and downs of the way these issues were debated within the Communist Party and also between the Communist Party and protagonists and sometimes allies and sometimes enemies outside of it, especially on its left. So it makes for a really, really interesting story, and understanding the broader context of it makes it all the more interesting. On the other hand, when it comes to drawing lessons from this, there are some really serious problems, because the book is the product of its time and the product very much of its person as well. Magri was 79 when he died a couple of years ago, and clearly reflected on a period that mainly peaked for him in the 70s and 1980s. And in that period, you still see him talking about this kind of strategy, both dealing with the surges from below, but also absolutely requiring some kind of party. I mean, very much to Sam's point, what do you do when the conditions for the party, as we currently understand any kind of mass class party, simply don't exist anymore? If your strategy is linked so tightly to that, how do you go about building some new sort of institutions that at least approximate functionally what the party was supposed to do? Because without that, this kind of strategy, it seems to me, and any kind of strategy, doesn't seem to have many legs. And it's interesting in that regard that one can read my review of Magri and take the kind of issues that Magri talks about in concert with a couple of the other articles in the book, one by Mimo Porcaro and the other by Charles Post, both of whom very explicitly put Leninism up front and center. Well, and obviously what they mean by Leninism isn't, well, actually, Porcaro at least is quite explicit. He's talking about Lenin, not Leninism, because Leninism just has too much baggage. But nevertheless, what they're talking about there, it seems to me that without falling back into the old sloganeering and the old formulaic arguments, is also the recognition that Lenin and others since have had, that there is a need for some kind of organizational set of pillars on which any kind of strategy of transformation simply has to rest. Magri was always very, very clear about this. Otherwise, he said, the kind of pluralism that people celebrate on the left really ends up risking turning into nothing other than fragmentation without some kind of central, overarching umbrella that is nevertheless, if you know anything about Magri, not something that's Leninist in any understanding of the word, although this is someone who was a small c communist for his entire adult life. And I guess I can just close it out on that.
The only person alive who's published an essay in every decade of the Register's existence, John Saul.
Is that a promise or a threat? No, it's a curse. You want to read something very cursed, which follows on from something Meg was saying about what's in the Globe and Mail this morning and the like. Read the editorial in the Globe and Mail today called Hug the 1%. It's a phenomenal editorial. Anyway, that's not my topic, but it is part of the global struggle. My topic is based on my article, which is called Taming a Revolution, and it's about South Africa, and it talks about the manner in which South Africa has been disciplined to undertake a false decolonization in the course of its transition to black majority rule. It primarily deals with that key period of transition in South Africa in the early 90s, but the implications of that transition continue to exist, and I would say one of the payoffs of that kind of transition is precisely the massacre in Marikana that we witnessed last year in South Africa, as many of you are aware of that. Now, it is true that something more radical was expected from the South African transition, in part because of the intransigence of settlerdom, in part because capital had attached itself to apartheid as a system that guaranteed profits and cheap labor and exploitation, partly because people had to be mobilized to resist against it in a rather deeper way, perhaps, than in some of the other countries where liberation movements and nationalist assertions took place. There were those, of course, who argued from a different point of view, and Steve Biko, one of the very admirable leaders of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, said precisely at the time that the sort of similarity in the community, as he called it, would mean that, that people could hold together around the fact of being black to resist the overall system. And he actually says that in fact it could be played another way, and there were those in South Africa. The Progressive Party was one of them, a white party, largely sponsored financially by Harry Oppenheimer, one of the leading South African capitalists, who argued for a different kind of strategy. And Biko says the following: one country where it would be possible to create a capitalist black society if the whites were intelligent, if the nationalists were intelligent, is that the Nats being the ruling party, and that capitalist black society, black middle class, would be very effective at an important stage, primarily because a hell of a lot of the blacks have got a bit of education, and talking comparatively, speaking to the low class, so-called rest of Africa, and a hell of a lot more of them could compete favorably with the whites. And South Africa could succeed to put across to the world a pretty convincing integrated picture, with still 70% of the population being underdogs. And that was the position that he spelled out, and he said, but that can't happen because whites are aware of this, they're holding on to their power, and in fact that's why black works better than class in South Africa. Well, as it turned out, Biko, although it was quite a sophisticated analysis, and he had read his Fanon and was up to date on these kinds of questions, was actually mistaken. The Prague possibility, in fact, did win out in South Africa. And what I do in my paper is show the way in which this happened. On the one hand, slowly but surely, capital awakened to the nature of the threat against them, that there was a danger here of the threat becoming a socialist one as well as a struggle for democratic rights and a struggle against the racial structure. And I quote a number of people in the volume, in the article: Zach de Beer, Gavin Relly, who succeeded Oppenheimer as head of Anglo-American, Malcolm Fraser, the right-wing premier of South Africa, of Australia rather, who became the head of the Commonwealth delegation to South Africa on behalf of the Commonwealth, and who had a great influence on Brian Mulroney when he too became momentarily anti-apartheid. And the message was clear: we've got to do something about apartheid before there's a social revolution in South Africa. And in fact, in the end, that's what capital managed to do. It bullied the white dominated class, also being, of course, frightened by the rising popular resistance in South Africa. But capital and the ANC together, in effect, pushed the white regime to change things and move away from apartheid to a more class-based system of continuing exploitation. But that's only half of the story. The other half of the story, which I also talk about in the article, is the way in which the ANC, in particular, preempted the struggle and overrode the popular struggle on the ground in South Africa, led by the working class and various trade unions, led by the UDF and various community activist organizations. Slowly but surely, the ANC marginalized these forces in the name of a false decolonization, in other words, of a democratic resolution to what was really, in essence, a class struggle. Now, Rusty Bernstein, I quote in the paper, was a longtime ANC and SACP militant, and he said the following: mass popular resistance did revive again inside the country in the 1980s, led by the UDF and by Kasatu. But it led the ANC to see the UDF, this popular organization of community groups, as an undesirable factor in the struggle for power, and to undermine it as a rival focus for state mobilization. It has undermined the ANC's adherence to the path of mass resistance as the way to liberation, and substituted instead a reliance on manipulation and administrative power. It has impoverished the soil in which ideas leaning towards social solutions once flourished, and allowed the weed of free market ideology to take hold. So that, I think, is what has happened, and that's what we are left with at the end of the transitional period. Now, of course, that merely sets the stage for what happens next, from 1994 to the present, and this is what I am proposing to Greg that I should write about in the Socialist Register next time.
Next decade, wasn't it?
Something like that. I think that the setting is very clear, and so is the resistance. At one level, the ANC still passes muster as a quasi-legitimate victor in the liberation struggle. On the other hand, in South Africa, at the moment, in terms of the statistics about worker action, the statistics about community resistance, these are the highest in the world. resistance to the way in which the system is impacting upon people at the local level. Now, I have carried on this analysis in a book that I just completed, A History of South Africa with Patrick Bond, and I hope that'll be out for people to read. But I think it is important to see that what is happening here is, in fact, the next shoe is about to fall. Americana showed that the ANC was now ensconced in power, prepared to do anything to hold on to power. And I've made the comparison. This is a little like Sharpeville. It's a little like Soweto. This is a regime turning on its people the same way the white regime did in South Africa. And now it's the ANC doing it in the name of liberation, if you like, but in the interests of their own empowerment within the framework of a neoliberal strategy. And I think that's the story that has to be talked about, as well as the next shoe falling, as I say, how we might begin to see trade unions and popular movements beginning to come together and articulate a more counter-hegemonic strategy. It is beginning to happen in South Africa. We can talk a bit more about that, but it's a long way to go. It's difficult to do, so we'll just have to wait and see. But thank you very much.